Hey everybody! Welcome to CAF Warbird Tube, the show where we talk about World War II, aviation, history, and so much more. Warbird Tube is produced by the Commemorative Air Force, the world's largest flying museum. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and honor through flight and living history experiences. The CAF began the Warbird movement more than 65 years ago, and thanks to the support of individuals like you, we continue to grow strong. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and now our host, Steve Buss. Thanks for watching and keep 'em flying.
Good evening, airplane fans, and welcome to CAF Warbird Tube. Tonight, we're going to take a look at fighter combat techniques of World War II with author Steve Church, and you are watching episode 195 of CAF Warbird Tube. Now, whether it's your first time joining us or you're a long-time loyal Warbird Tube fan, we're glad that you're with us this evening. If you enjoy our content, please don't forget to spread it across your favorite social media platforms. We do appreciate that. Warbird Tube is made possible by the Commemorative Air Force. To find out more about the CAF, our events, our aircraft, our local units, our tours, those are coming up this spring, or how you can be a part of the action, just visit our website, commemorativeairforce.org. Now, as you're watching tonight, if you have some questions, just type those in the chat box and we'll try to answer them either during the presentation, or if we move on before we can get to your question, we'll save time at the end. Make sure we answer all of your questions. We do appreciate those of you who put some questions in. It's always fun to get some interaction with our audience. Well, right now, joining me from balmy St. Paul, Minnesota, is Steve Church. And Steve, you're the author of Fighter Combat of World War II. And I love this part of the book title, Stories and Tactics, 1939 to 1945. We'll talk about stories in just a minute, but we're going to start with a story, and that's your story. What is your background in aviation?
Well, I've been a pilot for over 40 years now. I started flying when I was a kid in the early 1980s, and I'm now a professional pilot. I fly a Phenom 300 at work. I was actually a flight instructor for about 15 years, so that was good, high quality work. I was an aerobatics instructor. That was like some of the most fun that I did. I was inspired to want to be a pilot actually by the fighter pilots of World War II. In fact, two of my chief inspirations are on the cover of the book, Don Gentili and Johnny Godfrey. And so I kind of wanted to commemorate them. And yeah, these are the people that made me want to be a pilot in the first place.
So you have an interest in World War II and especially fighter techniques, but what possessed you to actually put all these thoughts down into a book?
Yeah, it actually started as a seminar at Oshkosh in 2022. I had seen some stuff on YouTube about various fighter combat things, a Korean War video, and I thought, you know what, I should do something like that as a seminar at Oshkosh just to see if there's any interest, And so I spent about a year putting it together. I got together with the people that run the big Air Venture Air Show, and they were kind enough to let me be one of the presenters, and it was a big hit. The first one in 22 actually had standing room only crowd, and there was a lot of really good questions. In fact, one of the first questions that came out at the end of my presentation was, "Have you written a book?" And I thought, write a book? I mean, the idea hadn't even occurred to me. But that really started something going in my mind. And what I did is I used the format of the seminar for the book. So I just kind of used it as an outline. And as I say sometimes at the seminar, it only takes I only have 1 hour to say all this stuff. Other fighters met other fighters in combat tens of thousands of times in World War II, and it's hard to fit that in 1 hour. It took, It turns out there was, a couple 100,000 words that were on the chopping block, on the editing floor that I got to put back into the book. So
it's pretty good. And when you mentioned the stories, we were talking before we came on the air, that's really where you gleaned a lot of information, was from some of the narratives and after action reports that you'd been reading through the years as well.
That's right. Yeah, I call it one of my geek hobbies is reading World War II combat reports or after action reports. I've read hundreds of them, and then fighter pilot memoirs, group histories, things like that. and you can get a lot about the tactics that they were using then. When I would be sitting there thinking, well, there's a certain tactical point that I want to make here in the book. Oh yeah, I remember there was this one guy that did that in this one combat, and it's in his memoir. And I would just go upstairs to my collection. It's over 500 books on the subject, and for some reason I know where these things are, and I was able to find it and then cite it, and then get permission to use it later from the actual publishers of the original books, and yeah. That's how a lot of it went in. Of course, combat reports are government documents, so those you don't have to ask anybody permission to use those. But yeah,
is a lot of those after action reports, are those available online, or is it something you had to physically go research?
I do have a physical copy of a lot of them, mostly from the 4th Fighter Group. But online, there's a ton of after action reports, mostly at a website called World War II Aircraft-Performance.org. It is a fantastic website. I mean, if you want to know anything about the actual performance, it includes a lot of the actual performance tests that were done on the aircraft. And then, of course, it has a huge selection of Royal Air Force and Army Air Force combat reports. They're actually literally just PDF copies. I don't know, somebody must have done a heck of a lot of spent a lot of time at the National Archives and took a lot of pictures of these things. It's just a fantastic collection. And actually, that website is so important to me personally and to my book. It's actually cited many, many times in the book that I was reached out, and I worked really hard to try to get a hold of whoever is like putting the funding behind that website to make sure that it never goes away. Yeah. Absolutely could not figure out who it was. So I just have to hope that it continues, because, you know, maybe a trust fund or something, because it's just a really good website.
And I'm sure there are people just like me who are in the audience tonight that heard about the website and we're trying to write it down. So give us the address one more time.
It is WWII aircraftperformance.org. Not .com, but .org.
Okay. Very good. In your, when you're putting the book together, doing the research for the seminar, the presentation that you have done. You did it at Oshkosh. I assume you've probably done it at other places as well?
I have, yeah. I go to a lot of EAA chapters and some CAF squadrons and wings. Yeah, it's really fun. It's fun at those because you have a smaller audience, so you can get a question from almost everybody in the crowd. At the end, in fact, I've shortened the seminar now so that it's about 40 minutes, so I have a lot more time for Q&A, because that's kind of my favorite part of the whole thing is the Q&A. I call it Stump the Chump, and it's really fun. People come up with the most amazing questions, and I'm always impressed at what everybody knows or wants to know.
There you go. And you also did a presentation last summer at the Military Aviation Museum out in Virginia Beach, our friends out there.
I did do that. Yeah, that was that was one of my favorite online ones.
Okay.
I'm actually going to be doing my presentation for the docents of the National Air and Space Museum here in April as well. So I've been invited to do that. I'm really excited about it.
Good. And, speaking of questions, we already have one. How pivotal, if all, were the Finger 4 formations used by the Luftwaffe versus the style of formation used by the Spitfires?
Yeah, that was extremely important. In fact, I have my book it's 45 chapters long. It's in 4 sections, and section 3 is formations. And I start each section with a story. And what I do in this case, I started with Neil Kirby leading a formation of 4 Thunderbolts over New Guinea in 1943, and he was using a formation tactics that were almost identical to what the Luftwaffe developed during the Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s. And so the question became, how could this person way over here in a completely different Air Force be using tactics that were developed by a separate Air Force many, many years before? And so I go through that whole evolution. That's the only part of the book, in fact, that's chronological from beginning to end of war. And yeah, basically the Schwarm, as the Germans call it, was so influential that everybody that was still participating by the end of the war was flying their own version of it. Everybody just copied it because it was working so well. The one exception being the U.S. Navy, which developed what they call division tactics, pretty much on their own, with no outside influence from the Germans. It was pretty impressive, actually. It was mostly the result of a guy named Jimmy Thatch.
Oh, yes. The Thatch weave.
Yeah, the Thatch weave. Yeah, that was what led to division tactics, in fact. Yeah.
Okay. Speaking of some of the names that we've thrown out already, in your research, were you able to meet any of the World War II combat pilots?
Yeah, I've met some over the years. I met Richard Peterson because he's from Minnesota. He's the top P-51 ace from Minnesota. He's tied with a guy named Don Bierbauer for that honor. I can't meet Don Bierbauer. Unfortunately, he was killed in action in World War II. I met Hamilton McWhorter, who was the first Hellcat ace. I met him right at his house in San Diego way back in, I think it was 2003 or 2002. Really super neat guy. It was really fun to talk to him. He's actually featured heavily in the gunnery section of my book. His nickname was One Slug McWhorter because he was legendary for being able to shoot down aircraft using very little ammunition, and he was outstandingly good at deflection shooting, which was partly as a result of his training and partly as a result of his just innate natural abilities.
Well, and speaking of training, we have Jeff is putting in a question. What training did the pilots receive against working against dissimilar aircraft, and was there any training in World War II similar to what we know of from Top Gun?
I love that question. There was it was much more informal in World War II. One of the things that I like to do in the book is I go through a lot of in the dogfighting section. I go through all like what are known as modern BFM tactics. BFM is a term that was introduced, I think, in the 1960s, way after World War II. The way they trained in World War II was basically they would get together and just start dogfighting each other, usually with just the airplanes that they had in their own squadron. Dissimilar training would have been more likely if there was another group of friendly airplanes at a friendly air base nearby. So if you're at a Thunderbolt base and there's a P-38 base nearby, you could maybe get together and do some dogfighting with those guys and do some dissimilar tactics. There was very, very occasionally somebody got to experience fighting against a captured enemy fighter, but it was really rare. And there was generally no real effort to, no well-documented or well-known efforts anyway, to simulate the tactics of the enemy. It was just, let's just go out and do some dogfighting and see how it goes, kids, and there was varied levels of success on that, and there's varied levels of the training that people got. There was a lot of fighter pilots got into combat in World War II with almost no training at all of that kind of. And there was others that had literally hundreds and hundreds of dogfights before they got into combat, so they were a lot more well equipped for that type of action.
With the today's air combat maneuver training there's a syllabus, there's a whole a whole course that you go through that wasn't present in World War II. When did that sort of get developed? Was that something that came out of Korea or even later into Vietnam?
Yeah, there was some of it was being developed mainly at Nellis in the 1950s, and then later. Most of it got codified in the 1960s. But I mean, I've actually seen training videos from the late 1950s that use a lot of what are now modern military terms, BFM terms. Back in World War II, you would have heard if somebody did a high yo-yo, they would have more likely characterized it as a wing over. I pulled up and did a wing over and got back onto his tail. Something like that is what you're going to hear. And I talk about that a lot in the book. I give you examples of, for instance, lag rolls or lag pursuit rolls that I have found, and I'm reading between the lines of what they say. This guy made a really tight turn, so I pulled up and rolled around him and came back down on him from above. Well, that's probably a lag pursuit roll. Or I was overshooting my target, so I pulled up and did a tight barrel roll and then came back out behind him. That's basically a lag roll. And they didn't use terms like lag rolls and yo-yos and things like that back then. Some people were doing them, but it wasn't codified, and it certainly wasn't formally taught. I think a lot of these people just picked this stuff up because they had really good They had a lot of experience and like the ability to think in 3 dimensions. Whereas most people back then, when they were concerned about overshooting another aircraft, they tried to slam on the brakes. They would just cut the throttle, maybe put the flaps down, fishtail the airplane, something like that. That just demonstrates a fundamental lack of training on how to prevent an overshoot, which leg maneuvers like leg rolls and yo-yos, high yo-yos, are fundamental now, but that just wasn't formally taught back then.
Can you talk a little bit about the techniques that the American Volunteer Guard in China used prior to the United States entering the war?
Yeah, the AVG, they were masters of, primarily due to the influence of Claire Chennault, they were masters of hit and run tactics. And hit and run tactics were really the name of the game for everybody through the entire war. It's one of the basic premises of the book at the very beginning and fundamentals that I talk about. There's this common modern misconception about World War II fighter combat that it mostly involved dogfighting, when in fact, the vast majority of fighters that were shot down by other fighters were shot down in surprise attacks from behind. And they were exceptionally good at that at the AVG. Even in the Pacific Theater, you had these very maneuverable airplanes, the Zero and the Oscar, and even the Japanese were using hit and run tactics. And as I say in the book, there's 2 reasons for that. Or for the Americans, it was because the Americans largely figured out that it was foolish to dogfight with Japanese fighters. And for the Japanese, it was because the Americans figured out that it was foolish to dogfight with Japanese fighters. It takes 2 to tango. And if one side decides that there's not going to be a dogfight and they have the speed, if their aircraft has enough speed to prevent a dogfight, there's not going to be a dogfight. And that's what the AVG was. That was one of the things they were doing that they did really well. There's an example of a surprise attack right there. That's you up in the sun swooping down on your unsuspecting enemy. That's from a tactical manual done by Jimmy Thatch, actually. And in addition to inventing the Thatch weave, which, by the way, he did not name it the Thatch weave. It was he called it the beam defense position. He wouldn't name something after himself. It was Jimmy Flatley that named it the Thatch weave. At any rate, he after the Battle of Midway was over, he got assigned to a tactical school in Jacksonville, Florida, and he came out with, I think it was close to 20 little tactical pamphlets about defense against fighters, offense against bombers, offensive tactics against fighters, all these different things. And they even came out with little movies that went along with them, and most of it was illustrated by Walt Disney people, and the movies were put together. Walt Disney helped him with that, so he's going back and forth between Jacksonville, Florida, and LA to work with Disney on these things. There's a couple of them that are available online. They're really fun to watch, and Thatch himself actually narrates them, which is really fun to listen to. He's kind of a big hero of mine.
Well, and where did Claire Chennault's inspiration come for knowing to use the kind of hit and run that he was so successful in leading the AVG with? I mean, was it something he just picked up, or was it influenced from somewhere else?
I think that was his individual brilliance. Honestly, he's a very pragmatic guy, and he realized, okay, well, you can't fight the way the enemy. You can't fight with the enemy's strengths. You have to figure out what your own strengths are and use those. And I mean, he may have also realized just some of the basic fundamentals that I talk about at the very beginning of the book, and that is that speed was king in World War II fighter combat. Speed was king, and that was because of surprise attacks, and it was also because of, there we go, the speed contest. Planes kept getting faster and faster and faster throughout the war. And even the Japanese, who originally thought maneuverability and dogfighting was going to win fighter combat, even they eventually realized speed was going to dominate, and because they were getting dominated by speed. And the reason for that, I mean, you have to realize that the reason for that was because of the weapons they were using. It was guns. Guns were the only weapons that fighters used against fighters in World War II. There were some, every once in a while somebody would shoot a rocket at somebody or something like that, but mostly the rockets and the air-to-air bombs and stuff were designed for shooting down bombers. And my book is just about fighter versus fighter combat. So fighter versus fighter, it's only guns, and guns have very limited range. So if you have a faster fighter, you can keep the best guns defense is just to stay out of range, right? So if you're faster than the other guy, you can stay out of his gun's range, and if he has a more maneuverable fighter, it's not going to do him any good unless he can get close enough to use that maneuverability. And then if you have a faster fighter, you can get into guns range on a slower fighter, and they cannot prevent it. So that's why speed dominates. And that's flying just before that. I actually have a little. This is one of the fun things about writing the book was putting together these illustrations. I have there's over 60 original illustrations like this that were put together. Me and a guy named Jerry Bacoli, a local artist that I have around here, is really fun to work with. He's just brilliant, and I wanted him to come up with illustrations that looked like they came out of World War II training manuals, because I have a lot of images from World War II training book manuals in the book. So I thought it'd be fun if the new illustrations kind of had the same look and feel. And this is one of them. It's the typical turning radius was 500 to 1,500 feet, and the typical firing distance was the same. So if you couldn't get within somebody's turning radius, you really weren't able to use your guns. Now, the maneuverability, of course, was wonderful on defense. If somebody did get within, if a fast fighter got within 500 to 1,500 feet and was going to use its guns on you, and you detected that, you knew it was about to happen, if you had the more maneuverable fighter, that was going to help a lot. But, it didn't solve all your problems. And eventually, you're going to have to get out of there and go home, and you can't just turn all day.
Right. So if you had to pick one, speed versus maneuverability?
I would pick the faster fighter every time if I was a World War II fighter pilot, yeah. And that was one of the reasons P-51 dominated. In fact, I start the book by asking a question. Why was the P-51 such a dominant fighter in the later part of the war in 44 and 45? And it was because it was, when it first came out in December of 43, it was the fastest fighter in the world. And it was faster than German fighters in top speed and, very importantly, in diving speed. It's the same reason, excuse me, it's the same reason that the Messerschmitt 109 was dominant at the beginning of the war, because it was the fastest fighter. It was faster than all the British fighters, all the Russian fighters, and they used that speed to dominate their enemies. In fact, the only aircraft that was competitive with the Messerschmitt 109 in the early part of the war was the Spitfire Mark I, which was just about equal or maybe a little bit faster during the critical phases of the Battle of Britain, which was just remarkably lucky for the Allies. In fact, one of an analogy that I do in the book is they talk about the Spitfire and the Hurricane in the Battle of Britain, okay, to illustrate the importance of speed. So you had two aircraft that basically they had the same pilots, the same everything was the same pilots, the same bases, the same training, the same tactics, same formations. Everything was the same, except one was a Spitfire and one was a Hawk or Hurricane. They even had the same guns, the same amount of ammunition. Everything was the same about them. But the Spitfire did a little bit better kill to loss ratio wise than the Hurricane did against the Messerschmitt 109. And the only difference was speed. There's some really good research that was done by John Alcorn and Dilip Sarkar, where they talk about they isolated all the losses. Now, if you're looking at kill to loss ratios, you can't look at claims. You have to look at losses. Mm-hmm. So they came up with all the losses. One of these guys came up with all the losses of the German aircraft and what shot them down, what type of aircraft shot them down. And then Dilip Sarkar, he came up with what shot down all the Spitfires and the Hurricanes. And you take their two results and you put them together, you can come up with a pretty decent kill-to-loss ratio. And it turns out the 109 dominated the Hurricane by just a little bit better than 1-to-1. The Spitfire actually dominated the 109 by just a little bit better than 1-to-1. That was probably the only aircraft that dominated the Messerschmitt 109 all the way up till 1942 or after.
Are there any pros or cons, radial engine versus inline when you're engaged in a dogfight?
Yeah, I mean the main con of inline is going to be the vulnerability of the cooling system. You have a lot more of a vulnerable area, so you have not just the engine that's vulnerable, you have all the coolant lines and the radiator. So any hits, and so they're just they're less tough, if you will. radial engine aircraft are going to be tougher, and they're going to have a smaller vulnerable area. But of course, on average, inline engine aircraft tended to be a little bit faster. So
you have that.
Yeah. Yeah, that was the whole idea. You didn't have to have the fastest fighter in the world to dominate either. You just had to have the fastest fighter in your local area, and I think the Pacific is a good example of that. The planes that we were flying in the Pacific were generally not the fastest fighters in the world at the time, but they were a lot faster than Japanese fighters, and that's what counted. So that shows.
You were talking earlier about lag pursuit and this kind of illustrates it, but for those not familiar with that, can you walk us through this illustration?
Yeah. So one of the things that happened a lot is there was a lot of basically these fighter pilots when they're in a friendly area, they were a training. Something they did in training was to just try to attack friendly aircraft, basically, without actually shooting at them. They would try to do a curve of pursuit to try to get into a gunnery position on, just any airplane that they'd see flying along. In fact, it was kind of a sport. It was a contest between people sometimes. And there's three different ways of closing on someone. You use either lead pursuit, pure pursuit, or lag. And the most common amongst the rookies was pure pursuit, where you just point your nose right at somebody and try to close with them. It doesn't work very well. It's only going to work if you have a lot of overtake already, and if you're at the same speed, you're probably not going to ever overtake them just using pure pursuit. With lead pursuit, even if you're in a slower plane, you might actually be able to catch up to and get behind somebody who's faster than you. But it speeds things along a lot. So you just put your nose well in front of the flight path of whoever it is you're trying to close with, and then you can judge it from there. And if you see who it is you're trying to close with kind of moving backwards on your windshield, that means you've got a lot of lead pursuit. If they get stationary and just start getting bigger, that's called lead collision these days. Now, these, again, they're modern terms. They wouldn't use them back then. In fact, there's a Royal Air Force book where this like a little tactical training manual where this guy did this really long diatribe on how to close with other aircraft. Not once did he ever use the word lead pursuit. He was describing it, but he never used the term lead pursuit. And then lag pursuit was basically a way to help control closure once you finally did get in close. If you're worried about overshooting, instead of hitting the brakes, just use a little bit of lag pursuit, and you might be able to prevent an overshoot. And it also got you towards the vulnerable 6 o'clock area of your enemy. There you go. That's what it looks like from the cockpit. Everybody likes P-51, so it's a P-51.
Of course.
Yeah. So there you go. The sneak attack, the classic, right? I mean, this is how there's a book that came out many years ago called The Ace Factor, and the author of that book did a lot of research and estimated that upwards of 80% of the fighters that were shot down by other fighters in World War II either didn't discover the attack at all or discovered it too late to do much about it. So surprise was absolutely key. And that's swinging back to the swarm, or what we call the finger four formation. That was one of the chief attributes of that formation is the ability to achieve or prevent surprise attacks. It was just wonderful for that. It also helped our aircraft stay together once maneuver combat started. But
Henry's got a question for you, and it says, it seems like the Allies shared aircraft and component technology like engines. Did the Axis do much of that? Henry says maybe, or it would seem like the German planes in the Pacific would have been bad news for the U.S.
I agree. If the Japanese would have actually been able to employ actual Messerschmitt 109s or particularly FW-190s in the Pacific in 1942, we'd have had a big problem. I mean, just look at the F-4F Wildcats that defended Guadalcanal, right? They were going against the Zero, which was a little bit faster than the Wildcat, but not hugely faster. If the Japanese could have somehow, they wouldn't have had the range to do this, but if they could have somehow had an island really close to Guadalcanal where they could have launched FW-190s against those Wildcats, they would have shot down John Smith's squadron within 2 days. They would have taken care of them. Plus, just even the armament to the FW-90. But yeah, engine technology was huge. One of the big advantages we had there is fuel, a high octane fuel. Especially towards the end of the war, our octane levels, they're actually octane equivalency levels when you get above 100 octane, but they were up to like 150 grade fuel that they were running in World War II in American fighters and British fighters towards the end of the war. That's just tremendous, and the Germans were never able to field anything higher than 90 something, like early, like 91 or 92 octane, I think. And they had a lot of 87 octane around, and that seriously limited the power output of their engines, so they had to have bigger engines to make up for that.
And an interesting question here from Ken. How is it possible that friendly aircraft could be confused with an enemy fighter, leading to friendly fire incidents?
Oh yeah, there was a lot of friendly fire incidents. There's a lot of ways that could happen. For one thing, and I talk about this, the last chapter of my book is called The Long Nose Effect, and it's about how pilots were misperceiving that they were fighting against long-nose FW-190s and specially modified Messerschmitts when they actually weren't. In the heat of combat, it's really hard to discern one aircraft from another until you get close enough to see the markings. Another thing is today we have tens of thousands of images of all the airplanes of World War II, and you can study them to the most minute detail. You can be what they call a rivet counter if you want, right? Back then they didn't have any of that kind of stuff. They didn't have many really good high-quality photographs of enemy aircraft. Even if they got captured ones, it may not be the version that you're actually fighting against now. It may be one from a couple years before. So, and then they had all these models hanging from the ceiling, So most of the aircraft recognition training was done with drawings or silhouettes that were sometimes pretty accurate, but not always extremely accurate. So that's one factor right there. And then, of course, there's just the heat of combat and the fear factor. You might end up. There's also the kind of the killer instinct factor. I see a plane that can't possibly be one of our guys. It has to be an enemy because of whatever the circumstance is, and then you get in close range and open fire, and whoops, that was a good guy. People were trained to do things that they weren't in reality capable of doing in a combat situation sometimes. Range is one of them. The most common gunnery error in World War II, by far, was shooting from outer range. And in your gun sight, you actually had a way to estimate range. That didn't keep people from screwing it up. They screwed it up all the time anyway, So screwing up aircraft identification, yeah. And then another thing I think we have to think about here is you had to have at least 20/20 or better vision to get accepted, but in 20/20 is just a standard. 20/20 isn't perfect eyesight. It's just a standard that we've been using for years. Most of the fighter aces had considerably better than 20/20 vision, you might have somebody out there that's kind of sliding by, squinting to make that 20/20 chart, and he might have a hard time recognizing an enemy versus a foe, versus a friend. So there's a lot of factors like that.
Sean is wondering if pilot's armor also played a role in survivability, along with speed.
Armor? Yeah. In the gunnery section of my book, I talk a lot about pilot armor, and yeah, that was huge, or the lack thereof, right? Japanese planes were famous for not having pilot armor or self-sealing fuel tanks, and just about everybody else in the world did it. If they didn't start the war with them, they started modifying their airplanes and adding them right away. That was huge. Now, pilot armor didn't always stop the enemy bullets. I actually have a story in the book about a guy named Lardner Burke. He was a Royal Air Force pilot flying over Malta in a Hawker Hurricane, and a Mach 202 got in behind him and shot the Italian equivalent of a 50 caliber round, and it hit the armor plating, went right through him, through the instrument panel, and right out the front of the airplane. He managed to actually land. He survived it. He landed. He got out of the airplane, went to the hospital, eventually recovered, and then eventually flew Spitfires over Europe later. But the guys that showed up and looked at the damage, they were appalled. You know, they were like, wow, here's this armor plate, and it's like it just went right through it. And it had a lot to do with the range and the angle of which you hit the armor plate. If you hit it at an angle like this, it's more going to glance off, but the more direct the angle, the more likely it is to be able to penetrate the armor. It also has to do with what type of round was being fired. If it was a high explosive round, it's more likely to just blow up on the surface of the armor plating, or if it's an armor piercing round, it's called armor piercing for a reason, you know? So, but yeah, our pilot armor was huge, and it was practically a worldwide standard. Even the Japanese eventually got on board with that towards the end of the war. In fact, Mac McWhorter, One Slug McWhorter, the final zero that he shot down, every zero he fired at before that he hit and blew up, and this one he fired a really long burst and it wasn't catching fire, so he just held down on the trigger and it eventually started burning, but not nearly much as like the ones that he had seen previously, and he speculated that it probably had self-sealing fuel tanks, which was kind of brand new to them at the time. That was in February of 1945 over Tokyo, so that was kind of really towards the end of the war.
Right. Now, along with the research that you've done academically, you've also done some real-life simulations as well. I
have, yeah. I like the term real-life simulation because that's exactly what it is. One of the things that, how do I approach this? Basically, I have a Vans RV4. I got a bunch of buddies that have similar aircraft, RV6s. One of them has a Pitts S1S. And we formed a little squadron, and we simulate World War II fighter combat in our aircraft. And it's not like we're a bunch of crazy guys that went out and said, hey, let's just try dogfighting our planes, and what could possibly go wrong? No, we approach this with the same professionalism and culture of safety that we do in our professional jobs. We're all professional pilots, and we're all fully, highly experienced aerobatic pilots. And so we set up our own training course, and we started with formations, and we taught ourselves formation flying, and then we got the NATOPS manual and adopted U.S. Navy rules of engagement, and then just kind of customized them to what we do with our aircraft, smaller radius, a lot faster turn rates. And then we approach it very carefully, and a lot of critique, a lot of abuse afterwards in terms of, hey, you screwed that up. But a lot of fun too. It's my friend Brad calls it the sport of kings, which it really is, and it's been really, really fun. It's really a childhood dream. I wanted to be a fighter pilot, like a lot of people did when I was a kid, and I wear contact lenses in here. I've had them since I was about 14 years old. Originally, it was glasses, and so that was out. You know, I wasn't going to be a military pilot, but I wasn't going to take no for an answer either. So it took a long time, but eventually me and my friends were able to do this, and it's been really fun. And as you said, it's been really good research too. It's easier to recognize let's say a high yo-yo in a combat report that's written cryptically and doesn't use the word high yo-yo. It's easier to recognize that if you've done 100 high yo-yos yourself, right? And when you're reading somebody's memoir and you've done a lot of dogfighting yourself, it's a little easier to put yourself in the cockpit with them. And this is what I try to do with some of my writing too, is put the reader in the cockpit so that they can understand what's going on. Because sometimes it's hard to understand what in the world is going on. So I try to articulate that as best I can.
Very good. Jacob was asking, go ahead.
I was going to say there's Bob Goebel from Wisconsin. One of the reasons he's in the book is because he talks about eyesight and the use of your eyesight. You know, we talked about how a lot of the fighter aces had better than 20/20 vision, and he was one of those guys. He shot down 10 Germans, in fact. But one of the things that he said was, it was really important to me. It's not just having good eyesight, it's about how you use your eyes. There's kind of a knack that some people have for seeing other aircraft in flight. You can have two people with the same crystal clear laser-like vision, and one person is going to see airplanes and another one isn't, right? And there's a lot of factors that go into that. But he actually discovered it after he'd flown about 15 missions. He realized, oh, all of a sudden I'm seeing everything that everyone else is seeing. And he said he was using his eyes differently. And he said that he couldn't describe exactly what was the difference. He said it's like trying to describe the color red. you know what it is. You just can't like articulate it. But he said he did move his eyes more slowly than he had before, and not, just scanning really rapidly. He was more deliberate about how he was scanning the sky. It was one of the things he said. But I really liked the excerpt from his memoir where he talked about that. So I had to put that in there.
Good. And Robert, he wrote his book, I think it was published in 1991.
Yeah.
And there were, we talked earlier, and there are other books that were written, shortly after the war. Mm-hmm. Is there a difference in sort of how these combat veterans describe their experience from, say, books that were written 10 or 15 years after the war compared to like Goebel's book that was written in the 1990s?
Yeah, I think the later ones from the 1990s onward tended to be a little bit more raw, particularly with extracurricular activities that took place when they weren't flying missions. They were a lot more descriptive about that and used a lot less euphemisms and a lot more plain language to describe what was going on. So I enjoy that. But even just the descriptions of the combats themselves tend to be a little bit more vivid sometimes. Now, one of my favorite early memoirs is called The Look of Eagles. It's by John Godfrey, who wrote it in 1958. And that's a really, I think, a classic example. I really enjoy, and I love his book, but it's fundamentally different from, for instance, Bud Anderson's book, To Fly and Fight, which was also written in the early 1990s, if I can recall correctly, late 80s or something like that. And it's very vivid. Robin Old's book, Fighter Pilot, very vivid. So yeah, an early book, Al Deer, 9 Lives, the British Royal Air Force fighter ace from the Battle of Britain. 9 Lives is like a mind-blowing book, but this is one of the problems they had with Royal Air Force fighter pilots. They're so understated that it's hard to, they don't want to be accused of being a line shooter, so they kind of understate everything. He describes getting in a head-on collision with another aircraft in the middle of a dogfight as if he's describing just walking, taking his dog out for a walk, and so, and even the descriptions, you would think, oh, there's a lot of, there's Spitfire pilots, there had been a lot of great dogfighting, and yeah, I think especially early on in the war, the Germans were really willing to get in there and mix it up with British fighters over France and in the battle, to a slightly lesser extent, in the Battle of Britain. But they'll just say something like, well, we got into a good mix-up, and then I got behind him and I took a squirt. It's like, well, that doesn't tell me anything. It was like they didn't want to brag about it. So okay. So there's a lot, just for that reason alone, there's a lot more excerpts from Americans in this book than there are Royal Air Force guys. But a guy named Colin Gray, who was the top fighter ace of New Zealand, he had a book called Spitfire Patrol, and he came out with that. I think it was in the 1980s. It might have been the 90s as well. And again, he was a lot more free and vivid about what happened. So he had a lot of really good. It's a really fun book to read. If you can find a copy, they're really hard to find.
Jacob is wondering, German pilots like Erich Hartmann, Gunther Rahl, and Hans Joachim Marseilles scored more victories than many Allied pilots combined. Would you argue that the higher scores were because they were in a target-rich environment, and those are in quotes, or more of the sneak attack, the boom and zoom kind of operations?
I'd say both. They had, especially in the early part of the war, the Germans tactically were very superior to the Allies in terms of how they were using their aircraft. And then, the target-rich environment was a big factor. You could, you read a group history or a memoir of a Royal Air Force or an American pilot, and they can go mission after mission after mission without even seeing enemy aircraft. And now you have somebody on the Russian front flying a FW-190, and he's going out flying 5 missions a day, and he might see enemy aircraft on 1 or 2 of those. Then tomorrow the same thing might happen. An American pilot to get that kind of an opportunity would have to maybe go 2 months. So that definitely was a factor. But as they got more and more kills, their experience level and their expertise rose as well. So they became more wary and more skilled to a point where, undertrained people that had less missions were kind of cannon fodder to them. they were able to really get in on these guys. And well, for one thing, every name that you just mentioned, Marseille, Rawl, and Hartman, they were expert gunners. In particular, Hartman from his close range gunnery, and I talk about close range gunnery a lot in my gunnery section. Yeah, gunnery was huge, and I mean, basically, you could be the best pilot in World War II, but if you didn't know how to shoot straight, you were almost, you were almost worthless, So, the thing is most of the guys that flew in World War II did not get a lot of really good gunnery training prior to going into combat. So they had to learn the hard way in combat. And if you've flown 300 or 500 missions and met the enemy 150 times and shot down 50 of them, you're going to have a lot of good gunnery experience. So you're going to become an expert at that through trial and error.
Also, along the German lines, Bill is asking, because I know this is a fighter-bomber question, but do you know how the Germans developed their inverted head-on attacks against Allied bombers?
Well, they usually came in upright, and then they would bunt out of the way, or sometimes they would roll over before pulling. I assume we're talking about attacks against heavy bombers.
Yes.
Like B-17s and B-24s. That was, I think there was a guy named Meyer of Jägerschwader 2, who was the primary person that developed the head-on attack. They had captured a B-17 and realized it didn't have as many guns in front as far as defensive weapons. And so they thought, well, hey, if we want to have less losses, let's start attacking this thing from head-on. And so they just developed that as a kind of a standard German tactic. It was very effective. And I do talk a little bit about fighter versus bomber tactics in the book. I do say in the book, there's for fighter pilots, there's two kind of aircraft. There's fighters and there's targets. And bombers, unfortunately, were targets. And I go into that mostly in the gunnery section in terms of developing effective methods of attacking bombers. But yeah, the Germans they did a lot of that. As far as being inverted, I think some of them probably tried to invert their aircraft just because it would make it easier for them to get away. But I think a lot of them were just nosing down too, or as the British would say, bunting their aircraft right at the last second just to prevent a collision.
Speaking of British, were there any significant differences in tactics between the American and British pilots?
Yes, there were. In the development of the formations that were used, the British early on thought, when they were seeing the Schwarm, which is a widely separated groups of 4, they originally thought it was widely separated groups of 3 because everybody flew in fighters in formations of 3 except the Germans at that time. And then eventually they realized it was 4s. But there was a guy named Milan, Sailor Milan, a South African, who even before World War II, he was really not a big fan of the Royal Air Force methods, and he realized that fighter combat was going to happen a lot more than the bigwigs thought it was. They thought there was just going to be fighters against bombers, and he thought there was going to be a lot more fighter versus fighter action. So he developed a line of stern formation where we'd have 4 airplanes flying along in a string instead of 3 in a close Vic. And that became very, very popular. So he was heavily influential. He happened to be the top-scoring British fighter ace all the way up until Johnny Johnson overtook him. I think it was in 1944. So he was renowned, and so it was hard to question him. His string formation was really easy to train on, and it was more effective than what they had been using, but it had some fundamental flaws to it. And the main fundamental flaw was that if you are flying in a formation that's a string, everybody in the formation except the leader is basically looking straight ahead to try to stay in position on the aircraft that they're supposed to stay in position on. And where is the attack usually going to come from? Back there, not up there. And so it left particularly the trailing person, tail end Charlie as he became known, ended up being very vulnerable in these string formations. And because of Milan's influence and the fact that these formations had early on been more effective than the pre-war ideas, a lot of squadrons carried on with using this line of stern string formation way into 1944. I've seen videos online of Spitfires using that line of stern Milan style formation, and they have D-Day stripes on them, and they're flying out of France in the summer of 1944, which is long after Hugh Dundas and Douglas Bader had developed what they called the Finger 4 formation, which was basically a copy of the German formation. And it worked a lot better. The Americans, some of them were early on influenced to use the string formation, but pretty quickly they all started to adapt the Finger 4, and it was almost universal by probably late 1943 that Americans were using the Finger 4 style formations.
Well, we've compared the British to the Americans. Now, Bill wants to know if you could compare the Army Air Corps, Army Air Force to Navy. Which one had the better tactics?
Well, I don't know if you could say better, but one thing that the
more
US,
successful? Yeah,
more successful. I think one thing that the U.S. Navy did better than any Air Force, if you will, in the entire world in World War II was air-to-air gunnery. The Navy and Marines, they got more gunnery training than anybody else. They were really consistent about it. Their fighter pilots were more ready to shoot down another aircraft in high deflection shots on their first mission than any fighter pilots of any other force in the world, on average. So this was one of the reasons that Hamilton One Slug McWhorter was able to be so effective with high deflection gunnery early on in his career, and a lot of other people. Butch O'Hare is a great example of this, and he's heavily featured in the book. I have a whole section where I talk about gunnery techniques. I get into the nitnoid details about what methods these people were using to try to calculate deflection with a fixed reticle gun sight. And the Navy's method wasn't better than anyone. It's just that they trained a lot on it. They had a ton of experience, mostly flying against towed sleeves, target sleeves. They'd have a T6 or even another fighter go up and tow a target sleeve, and then they'd all go out and make passes at them. And you had earlier on shown all of the gunnery passes. They had all these standard gunnery passes, and that they had practiced over and over and over again. And they had a ton of ball ammunition, practice ammunition that they would use and they would paint the tips of the ammo different for every plane so that you could score yourself at the end. They were really, really serious about it, and it paid off big time. And the reason they did that is because of the aircraft carrier. They knew that aircraft carriers could be really vulnerable, and that one enemy aircraft could potentially take out the whole flight deck and strand a whole squadron of aircraft in the air. So the Navy fighter pilots had to be skilled enough at gunnery early on to be able to shoot down. The worst guy in the squadron would be the one you might be depending on to save your floating home when an enemy snooper comes in and tries to bomb the carrier. So that guy better be good. And so they gave him a lot of training. And it was they also emphasized deflection shooting because when you are right behind someone, not only is it easier for you to do gunnery, it's easier for the defensive gunners to hit you. Whereas with a high deflection shot, it's a lot harder for the defensive gunners to hit you. So that was another thing. If you're way out 1,000 miles away from your home base and you lose half of your squadron because they've been doing this kind of attacks on bombers, where are you going to get replacements? You can't. So their assets were a little bit more hard to come by, so they had to train the hard shots early on.
Is the old adage still true that the country boys who grew up hunting birds were better shots?
Well, yeah, and it wasn't always country boys, but yeah, the people that had a lot of experience with handheld weapons prior to getting into their fighter cockpits generally adapted a lot more readily to gunnery. Yeah, absolutely. Particularly people that had done a lot of shooting at flying objects like birds or clay pigeons and things like that. A great example being Joe Foss. He was an avid hunter before World War II, and he ended up being an outstanding gunner One of the reasons for him, though, was point-blank range gunnery. He was a strong advocate of point-blank range gunnery. I mean, Eric Hartmann is commonly associated with that, the top German ace, and in fact, I mean, he's so associated with it that I feel like people think that he invented it, but there were people doing that at the very beginning of the war. There was a Battle of Britain. There were several Battle of Britain aces that realized that the 303 machine guns in their aircraft were not going to be very effective unless they were really, really close, and so they were point-blank shooting in 1940. But yeah, shooting with handheld weapons was so important that I read in one of Dave McCampbell's interviews that he said that every U.S. Navy air base in the United States had a skeet range on it, and they were common overseas as well. And Army Air Force guys were getting a ton of skeet shooting and trap shooting as well. So yeah, it was recognized that was very important to develop your skill and your shooting eye, so to speak.
And speaking of deflection shooting, what was the key to effective deflection shooting? Richard has this. He says, for example, during his second tour, Richard Bong, the Ace of Aces, was required to do a lot of skeet shooting and trap shooting, just like you were talking about. Meanwhile, on the other side, the RCAF ace, George Buehring, had his own computational methods, where in one instance he could shoot down 2 opponents with 31 cannon shells. So,
yeah, George Buehring was, I think, a savant, basically.
Okay.
So one of the methods was they had gunnery tables. You could actually calculate gunnery. And I mean, gunnery is basically a mathematical question, right? If you have enough information, you can calculate the time of flight of the bullets and figure out exactly where somebody's going to be and shoot at that spot, and then they'll arrive, right? So if you could accurately estimate someone's true airspeed in flight and accurately estimate the angle off, you could, if you had memorized all these tables like Buehring amazingly had the capability of doing, and he had the capability of skillfully flying his gun sight to that exact spot and the discipline to be able to fire only when he was exactly on that spot, few people could do that, but he was able to do that. So yeah, that was the method, if you will. And I go into great detail on those methods. I think one of the interesting things about World War II fighter gunnery is, for most of the war, they were using these fixed reticle sights. In a modern fighter, you steer, if you're going to use your guns, you steer what they call the death dot onto the target, and then you pull the trigger, and the bullets are going to hit exactly where that dot is. With a fixed reticle gun sight, if you put the dot, the pipper, directly on the enemy aircraft, you are more likely to miss than to get a hit, unless you were directly exactly behind someone. Even with just 5 degrees of angle off, you had to have some allowance, some deflection in there, and people weren't doing that. It's one of the reasons that you can see gun camera films of people just firing in these long bursts of fire, not hitting anything, even though it looks like they're right behind. If you look carefully, they're probably about 5 degrees off, and they probably have the pipper directly on that guy, and so they're missing. And it happened all the time.
Susan's asking if you can comment on any of the tactics or missions of Colonel Robert Scott of the AVG.
Yeah, I mean, he was an AVG pilot, and he stayed on to stay with the 23rd Fighter Group. And he was a classic hit and run fighter pilot. Apparently, he had outstanding eyesight. He was able to find the enemy before they found him. Altitude advantage, of course, was really important. He was flying a P-40, so if he's going against a zero, he didn't necessarily have a big speed advantage. But if you have the altitude advantage, you can come screaming down behind somebody and shoot him from behind. So, and he clearly had some good gunnery skills as well. Yeah. Speaking of the speed advantage, as you can look at the tables and the charts of the maximum speed of these aircraft, but you got to remember, these people were not flying around at maximum airspeed most of the time, right? They're going to blow up their engine or burn or use up all their fuel if they're doing that. So they're usually flying around at some kind of moderate cruise speed. And so an aircraft that's slower than you, if it has it might be able to close on you and get an attack, even though it's a slower aircraft, particularly with an altitude advantage. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh no, that's okay. We're just about out of time, and want to let the audience know that wow, I don't think we can even get to all the questions. I think I got most of them, but we're going to have you back later on in the year to continue this conversation and maybe get more into some of the topics we've talked about a little bit tonight, like gunnery, and go in more in depth. But tell us, where can you find the book?
You can find it, the book at my website. It's fightercombat2.com. So fightercombatworldwar2.com with the number 2. I think you can use II as well. I think they have that domain. It is available on Amazon as well. It's a self-published book through Amazon KDP, so they're going to have it. It is cheaper by $10 if you order it on my website over Amazon, but it's available at both places.
Okay, good. And we're hoping that you'll be at Oshkosh again this year.
Yeah, and I do even more discount for people that show up at those things. Yeah, I'm hoping to be there and bring as many books as I can. And oh, by the way, if you buy the book on my website, I can sign it as well. I have a little thing there that says, hey, if you want a signed copy, just tell me how you want it to be signed, so I'll autograph the copy as well. And I always do that at the air shows. It's really fun.
All right, what's that website again?
It's fightercombat2.com.
All right. One request that we did have, and it'd be a little bit of homework for you. If you could maybe jot down some of the book titles and authors that you referenced tonight, we'll put those in the description of the video, and you can start your own reference library on this very hot topic.
The book has an extensive bibliography. I could literally send you pages of the PDF pages of the bibliography if that's what you want. But just even the stuff we talked about tonight, I can give you some of that too.
Sounds good. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, I just want to thank everybody that tuned in for being here, and anybody that's going to be watching later on the recorded version. It's a really exciting subject. It's my favorite subject. As you can see, I get really wound up and I can talk about it for hours. So come and see me sometime. I try to put the show on the road. I don't just do Oshkosh. I try to get to various museums around the country. And if you're part of a museum or a CAF wing or something like that, or a CAF squadron, talk to them about me showing up, because I'll respond to invites as readily as I can, and I'd love to come and visit you.
Sounds good. Steve Church, thank you for spending time with us tonight. We appreciate it, and we look forward to scheduling a follow-up episode a little bit later on in the year.
Sounds great.
All right, and thank you for joining us tonight and for all of your questions and comments. We really appreciate it. It makes this a super fun hour, that is for sure. And if you have any thoughts on some future topics you'd like us to explore, just drop us a line at media@cafhq.org. And if you liked what you saw tonight, please share it across your social media platforms. We appreciate that. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you click the bell icon. You'll get notifications when our new episodes are posted. Until next time, I'm Steve Buss, wishing you blue skies and tailwinds. Have a great night.